Welcome. It is a pleasure to introduce this short video series summarizing the findings of my PhD dissertation entitled Tradition as Flow, Decolonial Currents in the Muslim Atlantic. Let me begin by acknowledging that I have produced these videos and this dissertation in the colonial settler community of Waterloo, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. More importantly, I am against the settler colonial project of replacing indigenous communities on this land, which is part of a global colonial project begun by Western Europeans over 5 centuries ago. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand conquered Granada, thereby defeating the last Muslim dynasty in Spain. Within a few months, they sent Christopher Columbus westward across the Atlantic. His expedition would be the first step in the genocidal conquest of the Americas by Europeans. Latin American scholars associated with the decolonial school of world systems analysis, such as the Argentinian-born philosopher Enrique Dussel, advanced that these events in 1492 gave birth to the modern colonial world system we still live in today. I concur with this assessment, and my research seeks to contribute a complementary, critical perspective to the Latin American one. My dissertation offers a critique of the modern colonial world system from the long-term perspective of Muslims in the Atlantic world. You see, perspective is important. From a Eurocentric perspective, modernity represents a period of geopolitical and economic expansion for the Christians living in the northwestern margins of the immense African Eurasian world. These people, now known as Western Europeans, gradually became the center of a global political, economic, and cultural system after 1492. The Muslim perspective is different. Modernity was imposed on Muslims as a foreign colonial project. Muslims gradually lost their status as the dominant community at the center of the African Eurasian world, as they were forced into the periphery of the modern European colonial system. It's also important to recognize that the modern colonial European project was motivated by a deep rivalry with Muslims. European crusaders and merchants returning from Western Asia and Northern Africa had been reporting for centuries that the Muslim enemies were generally much more advanced in terms of science, technology, medicine, industry, and arts. Muslims benefited from their strategic position at the center of the African Eurasian trade routes. However, Christians, living in lands once ruled by the powerful Roman Empire, were comparatively poor. For instance, literacy rates in Western Europe were considerably lower than in the lands ruled by Muslims. This situation led to a growing impression among European elites that they needed to exit this period of darkness, eventually labeled the Dark Ages, to better compete with Muslims and eventually defeat them. The anti-Muslim zeal of the Crusades fueled European dreams of modernity as a rebirth, indeed a renaissance, after a long period of perceived obscurity. Having been defeated after long centuries of warfare in the eastern Mediterranean lands, the Catholic Crusaders switched their focus to fighting the Muslims living in northwest Africa and the lands now known as Spain and Portugal, but then known as Al-Andalus. Muslims living near the Atlantic Ocean were among the first peoples to undergo the process of modern colonial marginalization. The same can be said of other Atlantic peoples, such as the Jews of Spain, the Guanches of the Canary Islands, and the Arawaks of the Caribbean. All these peoples learned centuries ago that the modern colonial project, born in Western Europe, represents an existential threat to their bodies, but also to their unique traditions of being, knowing, and behaving. Therefore, resistance to Europe's modern colonial project has always involved more than a military, political, or economic struggle. It has also been an ongoing fight to protect diverse spiritual, intellectual, and cultural traditions. I propose four main arguments in my dissertation. 1. That a distinct Western Islamic tradition emerged in Northwest Africa and Southwest Europe between the 18th and 15th centuries. 2. That the disruption and colonization of traditional Islam by European powers was a constitutive aspect of the early modern colonial world system born in 1492. 3. That traditionalism developed as one response to this disruption. 4. That the unfinished process of decolonization requires explicitly affirming the value of the diverse traditions disrupted by the modern colonial project. These arguments are based on my examination of long-term historical processes which can be summarized as progressing through four stages: tradition, disruption, traditionalism, and decolonization. Each of the next four videos in this series deals with one of these stages. For now, let me clarify some of the key terms I use. For example, tradition. Like modernity, tradition can mean very different things depending on your perspective. In the Islamic context, I understand tradition as a metaphysically inspired, dynamic flow from the past into the present and future. This flow is neither conservative nor progressive. It's not conservative in the sense of resisting change and trying to stop the flow of history, and it's not progressive in the sense that it does not reject the past in favor of a future utopia. Instead, tradition seeks to transmit a heritage valued as important, indeed sacred, by a given community. This community seeks to perpetuate the aspects of their heritage they consider essential by keeping them alive and adapting them to changing contexts. But some circumstances represent an existential threat to traditional ways of being, knowing, and behaving. For Muslims, modern colonial European expansionism has long represented such a threat. Traditionalist Islam is a term I use to designate one response to the colonial disruption experienced by Muslims. Admittedly, traditionalist Islam may seem like a vague category, but it refers here to a specific intellectual current particularly influential among Western Muslims. Traditionalist Islam can be described as a discourse about traditional Islam. Genealogically, it draws upon many sources. Two important ones are the oeuvre of French metaphysician and Sufi René Guénon, also known as Abdelwahid Yahya, and the Chadhri school of Sufism born in North Africa. Traditionalist Islam distinguishes itself from two currents it represents as two extremes of the same modern and anti-traditional ideological spectrum, namely fundamentalism and modernism. In contrast, traditionalism portrays traditional Islam as perpetuating sacred lineages, which date back to the early Islamic era. The two most influential or well-known North American scholars associated with traditionalist Islam are Sayyid Hussein Nasr and Hamza Yusuf. However, this dissertation also introduces several less renowned scholars who contribute to traditionalist discourse, including women and people of African descent, whose contributions are often neglected. Many North American Muslim scholars associated with traditionalism are connected to Islamic lineages from Northwest Africa. When they critique modernity by drawing upon Islam as a dynamic, diverse, and holistic tradition, they build upon a transatlantic history of metaphysically centered resistance. Since the 15th century, Northwest Africans have played a key role in an anti-colonial struggle to protect their bodies and lands, as well as their spiritual and cultural traditions. This dissertation joins a nascent conversation between traditionalist Islam and decolonial world systems analysis. It endorses the call made by decolonial theorists for multiple interepistemic decolonial conversations. The main research question asks what a critique of the modern colonial world system looks like from a traditionalist Islamic perspective within the Atlantic world. Traditionalist discourse portrays modernity as the symptom of an unprecedentedly violent, anti-metaphysical, and anti-traditional spiritual illness incubated in Western Europe and spread globally through colonialism and imperialism. This series examines the historical processes through which the Western Islamic tradition developed before and after the disruption of European colonialism, and how Muslims drew upon their tradition when responding to this disruption. These historical processes led to the emergence of a religious, cultural, and socio-political network connecting Muslims living in the African, European, and American lands neighboring the Atlantic Ocean. I refer to this network as the Muslim Atlantic. The historical analysis of the next three videos provides the context within which to understand the theoretical contributions of the last one, which focuses on the unfinished business of political, economic, cultural, intellectual, and spiritual decolonization. I argue that Muslims must engage in two types of decolonial conversation, an internal one and an interepistemic one, which engages other communities. Traditionalist Islamic discourse can contribute positively to both types of conversation. Moreover, I insist that the traditions of the Muslim Atlantic must be understood in relation to the Black Atlantic, examined 3 decades ago by British scholar Paul Gilroy. As a North American Muslim, I find it crucial to assert that while Eurasian Islamic traditions should not be neglected, African Islam has been the main historical source of traditional Islamic flows in North America. And since Muslim Atlantic currents overlap significantly with Black Atlantic ones, the broader African and African diasporic intellectual heritage should play a crucial decolonial role for North American Muslims of all origins. Ultimately, I argue that Muslims well versed in their traditions of being, knowing, and behaving should join decolonial conversations with other communities marginalized in the modern colonial world system. One such conversation, to which my dissertation seeks to make a significant contribution, is the emergent dialogue between traditionalist Islam and decolonial world systems analysis. I hope this introduction has piqued your interest. Please stay posted for the next video, which is devoted to tradition in the Western Islamic world. Salam.